Did you know that a lot of early filmmaking was shot in sepia tone? I think it's kind of beautiful. Everything's brown and maybe a little glowy. You can really see the reflection in my glasses, which is annoying, but whatever. Today on History with Mr. E, we're talking about section 23.3, Teddy Roosevelt and Foreign Affairs. Today we're mostly going to focus on the Panama Canal. It was a 14,000 mile trip to go from the U.S. East Coast to the West Coast and/or from the West Coast to the East Coast by water. 14,000 miles because you had to go all the way around the tip of South America. So there's this little tiny strip of land where South America connects to Central America called Panama. And America negotiated a treaty called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty to build and police a canal at our expense in Panama. We had two choices actually for the site of the canal: the Isthmus of Panama, that small strip of land, or through Nicaragua, and to use the large Lake Nicaragua as a conduit, as a push through for to save us from having to build part of the canal. But it's still, Nicaragua was not ideal. It would still have been a 200-mile long canal. And so, even though there are major disadvantages, due to bad terrain in Panama and unhealthy environment in Panama, we still built the 5-mile long as opposed to 200-mile long canal in Panama. But there was a lot of stuff that we had to deal with before we could even put a shovel in the ground. First of all, the French had attempted to build the Panama Canal, but through poor management and massive amounts of yellow fever and other diseases, thousands of French people died, and they sold all of their digging equipment to the United States for $40 million and hightailed it back to the Champs-Elysees. That was really what pushed us to go forward in Panama rather than through Nicaragua, because here's all this equipment, But here's the thing: Panama was owned by Colombia. Panama went into revolt and declared independence. And since we were under an 1846 treaty to ensure the neutrality of the Isthmus of Panama, to our advantage, obviously, we sent warships, the warship Nashville, actually, to Colombia, to keep the Colombians out, And then Roosevelt went ahead and recognized Panama as an independent republic, much to the advantage of America. We built a new treaty called the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, and it gave America a 10-mile wide zone on either side of the canal to govern the canal through the Isthmus of Panama, and the U.S. would have to pay to build the canal. But then we would get permanent use and government of that canal. We paid $10 million plus an annual stipend of $250,000 to Panama, and we paid $40 million to France for all their equipment and whatever cheese they had left there also, because, that's pretty much all they eat, that and French fries, I guess. I've never really been to France. I heard they also like snails and vegetables cooked by rats. But those might just be rumors. I don't know. Construction began in 1904 on the Panama Canal, but really before construction could begin, we had to figure out how to deal with this yellow fever epidemic that killed off all the Frenchies that were there in the first place. Some man named William S. Gorgas was given the job of chief sanitary officer, and he took 2 years to burn the bush in, the brush that covered the area that we were about to dig through, and then drain all the swamps in Panama. And these swamps, of course, were the breeding grounds of the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes were the ones that carried the yellow fever. And once they eliminated that yellow fever, it was much safer for Americans to go and build the Panama Canal. Colonel G.W. Goethals was the chief engineer of the canal, and he set up a series of locks with gates on the canal to deal with the inclination or declination in the ground level. A lock works by you pull your boat in, it fills up, and then all of a sudden you move your boat along at a higher elevation. Of course, if you're trying to go down an elevation, you'd pull into a full lock, they'd drain it, open the gates, and you go down. Pittsburgh is chock full of locks and canals because of the massive amount of waterways that go through that city. So we got to learn about it when we were kids, and I always thought it was kind of fascinating. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. 10 years after construction began. It opened in the month of August. It had cost $400 million to construct the canal. But it shortened the sea voyage from East Coast to West Coast by 8,000 miles. 8,000 miles is a long way. And that was a triumph, obviously, for Teddy Roosevelt, although he'd been out of office for 6 years by the time it was built. So let's move on with Roosevelt. Other foreign policies for Roosevelt, when it came to dealing with Latin America especially, he had a motto: speak softly and carry a big stick, which meant we were a peaceful nation. We would act as peacefully as possible, but we were willing to fight and kick anybody's butt we needed to, or at least beat them with our giant stick made of wood. Teddy Roosevelt was used many times to negotiate because he was such a gifted schmoozer, basically. I mean, people just love the guy. In 1902, Germany and Great Britain blockaded the ports in Venezuela and even sunk boats in Venezuela and bombarded the coast of Venezuela in 1903 because the Venezuelan dictator, apparently the government has always sucked in Venezuela, refused to pay off their massive amount of debt to Germany and Great Britain. Roosevelt requested arbitration, and Germany refused. Roosevelt had to threaten our Navy, unofficially, but had to threaten to blow Great Britain and Germany out of the water, and Germany quickly backed down. Of course, we were allies with Great Britain, so we weren't going to fight them anyhow. But it was really Germany at the time was the aggressor. They were the one who sunk the boats in Venezuela and did the coast bombardment. If we'd showed up with boats, Great Britain would have been like, hey, buddy, and we're going to go back to Great Britain and, put on one of those weird furry hats or whatever we do over here, eat some blood sausage or something. I don't know. Roosevelt actually had his own corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. His policy, his corollary, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, was that the U.S. would do what was necessary to intervene if South American or Central American nations were being threatened by European nations. Not only would we stay out of their affairs if they stayed out of ours, but we would intervene in their affairs if they came over to our side to cause trouble. Basically, it gave Europe no excuse to be any part or try to do business in South America. South America was being exploited anyhow. They've always been a second world or a third world country compared to the United States. They don't have the natural resources, they don't have the good climate, and corruption has reigned for many, many, many decades in South America, especially when it comes to um, the brutal, vicious drug trade. The Roosevelt corollary would ensure that Europe had no excuse to take over or exploit South American countries. Moving on, Roosevelt also worked hard to keep the peace in the Far East, especially China. China had been for many years exploited by the Brits um, when it came to trade. They forced the Chinese into addiction to opium when over 90% of the population had become addicted. They forced them into bad trade agreements, and then many European countries set up what they called spheres of influence, where they basically just took over large portions of China and their ports so that they could force profitable trade and unprofitable for the Chinese, trade for themselves. And the U.S. through Roosevelt installed something called the open door policy, which asked Europe to maintain an open door to trade in China rather than fighting with the other European nations and forcing hard and bad trade with China. Europe reluctantly agreed to this because they knew that the American military, especially naval might at the time, was superior to anything that they could muster. Because after the Civil War, we built a massive iron fleet. Plus, this forced the ethnic Chinese to hate Europeans and Christians. And right around the turn of the century, they led a rebellion in China called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were Chinese political or patriotic Chinese nationalists, and they rebelled against any kind of Western influence. For years, China had closed their doors. Japan was also an isolationist nation for a long time, because every time Westerners came there, they exploited the Chinese and hurt them. And so they led a rebellion. The Boxers led a rebellion to drive out what they called foreign devils, and murdered 200 Westerners, especially Christian missionaries, and then they killed over 1,000 Chinese Protestants and many, many Catholics in China. It was pretty brutal. We had to send several European nations and a massive American strike force to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And then, of course, once the Boxer Rebellion was put down, Europe saw this as a massive opportunity to exert influence in China, and the U.S. had to threaten force against Europe again to maintain territorial and commercial integrity of China. And then Europe, still after the Boxer Rebellion, forced China to pay indemnities of $333 million. U.S. got $24.5 million of that, but returned more than half of it to the Chinese people to help them rebuild their broken nation. China used the return money to pay for the education of Chinese students, many of which were in the United States being educated. Roosevelt was also called in to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. When Russia invaded Manchurian China, a part of China that was owned at the time by the Japanese. And for his negotiations in the Russo-Japanese War, TR was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. One of the main problems with Asian countries and America at the time was Asians were willing to work for a lot less money in America and immigrate to America and work for a lot less money than the Americans were willing to work for. And they were hard workers at the time. So we in America began to segregate and regulate the influx of Japanese immigrants, especially in California, especially in San Francisco. Um, we even withheld passports of Japanese laborers trying to get to the United States, and ended up having to put forth something called the Gentleman's Agreement to settle that. The last thing today, and I know we're going on long, is the Great White Fleet. Teddy Roosevelt, in a way that pretty much only Teddy Roosevelt could do, sent a cadre of 16 U.S. naval ships on a world cruise in 1907, battleships, painted bright white, on what he called a goodwill tour. But really all he was doing was flexing his muscles. I mean, yeah, there was plenty of goodwill that was done. We helped some people out and did some things, passed out stuff to suffering people. But really all we were doing was saying, this is our Navy, this is just a little bit of it, and, come get some if you think you can try. This is the era when they came up with the motto, join the Navy and see the world. But really, we were taking our Navy and showing the world that we were the most powerful Navy on earth at the time. Nobody could keep up because we were in the middle of a massive industrial revolution, and our nation was extremely prosperous. And that's it for today. Thank you.